Hello, Dog Nation. I am Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We are presented today by Breda Pest Management. We're happy to have you with us. Mike Griffith stops by. That's going to be fun. Mel Kiper said some really nice things, but a couple of dogs who were at the NFL Scouting Combine last week. We'll talk about that. But one thing in particular to kind of pull out as it relates to Nolan Smith, because in the midst of really giving Nolan a great deal of praise, and I want to bury the lead, Kiper had some great things to say about Nolan. But in the midst of all this, he did offer an evaluation that I think sets us up for a conversation today about Georgia more so than about Nolan. So we'll do that coming up here in just a little bit. But off the top of the show, woke up thinking about this today. We're getting very close to spring practice, about a week away. And I think a position group I'm probably the most excited about for Georgia might be that wide receiver spot. I'm going to talk about why based on what we had last year, saw for Georgia, what Georgia kind of adds to that group here for this year. There's just a lot of reason to be pretty optimistic about what Georgia might have at the wide receiver spot. New quarterback, new coordinator, a lot of new, but what happens there at wide receiver make the transition at those two spots maybe a little easier there as well. So what do you say we start having that conversation off the top here today? It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Breda Pest Management, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Breda Pest Management, the official pest control of UGA Athletics.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
Getting ready for the start of spring practice for Georgia coming up here in just about a week's worth of time, and you start really thinking about, okay, what is the 2023 version of the Georgia Bulldogs going to be all about? Eventually, we'll make our transition to the idea of go for three in 23. You know, what are those building block pieces that make go for three in 23 possible? What are you excited about that makes maybe this Georgia team a little bit different than the last two national championship teams for UGA? This is the time of year we sort of think about those kinds of things. And for me, I think a lot of this sort of centers around what Georgia's going to have at the wide receiver position. I think wide receiver right now is a very interesting position for Georgia. And I sort of think this for two reasons. Just at face value, I think Georgia at wide receiver looks really good compared to almost any crop of wide receivers that Georgia's had to start any season under Kirby Smart. You know, you think about, this position for Georgia for whatever reason, wide receiver has probably lagged behind some of the other position groups at UGA in terms of its overall production, the way that it's viewed, what it does to kind of populate the top end of the NFL draft. Wide receivers sort of lag behind a little bit at UGA. Even with the program having great success, a lot of that success hasn't always centered around the wide receiver position. But I believe there's a lot of reason to suggest that here in 2023 that might be different this time around. And I also think wide receiver could prove to be extra valuable for Georgia in a year like this because having a crop of trusted, dependable wide receivers, adding to that, I think is made even better because you are making a transition to a new starting quarterback. We talked a lot about that yesterday. And this transition also includes a brand new offensive coordinator who's no stranger to the program. Mike Bobo has been OC here before, and he actually worked at Georgia last year, as you're well aware of. But he is still going to be sitting in the big chair this year. The job of getting acclimated to that role probably made easier by the fact that I think right now on paper, Georgia just looks pretty good at wide receiver. I think this was true based on, kind of what Georgia had last year, what it brings back from what it had last year. But also, if we were to all kind of kick around, hey, what are the top newcomers to the Georgia program? In many years, you're talking about a five-star freshman and things like that. And obviously, there'll be some of those guys that have a chance to emerge for Georgia over the course of the offseason heading towards the fall. But really right now, the top newcomers for Georgia, I believe, probably stand to be the two transfer wide receivers. Dominic Lovett put up big numbers for Missouri a year ago. Ra Thomas, who had been the subject of some offseason controversy a few weeks ago, but all of that seems to have worked itself out legally. That's been taken care of, and now you can kind of view Ra Thomas, I believe, as solely a football player here for Georgia. And in doing so, you realize already probably little bit more than you're accustomed to bringing back from Georgia for Georgia, the wide receiver position. The three of the top five pass catchers from a year ago return for this team here in 2023, and you add Ra and Dominic Lovett to it. All of a sudden, boy, that looks pretty good, the wide receiver spot. And in fact, I was kind of thinking about, okay, so how do you articulate exactly kind of how impressive this has the chance of being? And so let's just do this for a moment. Let's look at the top receivers. I'm talking about pass catchers in the SEC a year ago. Dominic Lovett, the transfer, was 5th on that list. He's on the Georgia team here this year. Brock Bowers, 10th a year ago in the SEC in receptions for the year, receiving yards for the year. He's coming back to Georgia here this year. Then you get to Ra Thomas, was 14th in the SEC a year ago. He's going to be on the Georgia team this year. Ladd McConkey, 17th on this list. He's going to be on the Georgia team this year. So the top 17 receivers in the SEC from last year, 4 of those are going to play for Georgia this year. Doesn't that sound pretty good? When you say it like that, doesn't that sound like an offense that you can really do something with? Now, some people are going to say, well, yeah, we'll be able, a couple of those guys were doing this for Todd Monken a year ago, and that kind of puts, pressure on Mike Bobo to get the same level of production out of them. And in some respects, maybe it does, and that's fine. You'll certainly hold Mike Bobo to that standard. Anybody who coaches at Georgia is going to have a high standard to live up to. Mike Bobo's no different. But I think we can assume that after a couple of years' worth of seeing what you've seen from Ladd McConkey, and obviously a couple of years' worth of seeing what you've seen from Brock Bowers, they are trusted, dependable resources. And now you got Ra Thomas and Dominic Lovett to kind of go along with them there. And I don't know. I think that can be pretty fun. And I guess to sort of extend this out a little bit more is that, to me, it's not just this returning production, both the production earned at other spots in the SEC, in the case of Ra and Dominic, and it's not just the returning production here that matters to me. I think you sort of saw a little bit of a personality evolution for the Georgia wide receivers at the end of last season. I think it's a big reason that Georgia was able to win the national championship. Against a great wide receiver program like Ohio State, and let's face it, that's probably the best wide receiver program. They always seem to, Brian Hartline's been a great coach there. They kind of transition from, hey, this guy's the best wide receiver in the country, then he gets hurt. Now this new guy's the best wide receiver in the country. And they're taking the place of guys from a year ago that moved on to the NFL, and they were the best wide receivers in the country. I mean, clearly Ohio State's had this great ability to produce these great wide receivers, and yet when Georgia went to that game against the Buckeyes in the Peach Bowl, I think there was this thought within the Georgia building, within the Georgia program, of our wide receivers have to step up much the same way. Our guys have to be able to give a Marvin Harrison Jr. level performance if we're going to be able to actually win this game, emerge victorious, and go on to win the national championship. In fact, we're led to believe that prior to that game, Georgia wide receivers coach Bryan McClendon, who's also one of those guys who had been at UGA, former Georgia player, now back to the program, that McClendon had stepped up and challenged the Georgia wide receivers prior to that game against Ohio State to be as good as the guys on the other side. Now, in Los Angeles for the national championship, I had a chance to ask McClendon about that. Hey, did you give the grade? In fact, if you're watching a video, you see a little bit of footage of that conversation. I asked McClendon, hey, did you give the speech? What was that like? How did you challenge those guys prior to that game? Now, Brian's kind of a humble guy, so he didn't want to give himself credit, but he did talk about the attitude, the mindset that existed for those Georgia wide receivers prior to playing a great wide receiver program like Ohio State last December. This is what McClendon said about that.
Really, Coach did a great job of having everybody kind of going and putting everybody on the same page. And me talking was really just one of the pieces. It really was just one of the pieces. I think a lot of credit needs to go to these guys in the hard work that they've done and all the stuff that they put themselves through to get to this moment. You feel really, really proud for these guys that just put themselves in this situation.
So in this conversation that we're having right now of, hey, it could be really a breakout year for the Georgia wide receivers, I guess the other thing that sort of leads me to is that Bryan McClendon as the wide receivers coach could be one of the reasons why. I think McClendon is a very, very interesting member of this Georgia coaching staff. Having a chance to talk to him in Los Angeles, I played the full interview for you before. You can go back and find it, on the YouTube page if you want, but I've also played that full interview for you before. I just think McClendon's got that really special kind of – Kirby Smart said prior to last year this was the best coaching staff they'd assembled at Georgia. When you listen to a guy like McClendon talk, you certainly understand why Kirby might feel that way, because McClendon's another one example of these guys that just sort of seems to understand what the stakes are at Georgia and seems to really enjoy the success that UGA's having. He's a Georgia grad in his own right. This is his program, and he seems really proud to be able to contribute to that success. And if you're talking about getting more out of the Georgia wide receivers than you've ever got in the past, having higher expectations for that position group right now than you've ever had in the past, I think the influence of a coach like Bryan McClendon is really kind of one of the reasons why, because while McClendon didn't want to give himself full credit for the speech prior to the game, challenging those guys to step up, the results sort of spoke for themselves. The Georgia wide receivers did go out. They had a massive performance against the Buckeyes there that day. It is probably, along with the performance of Stetson and maybe a couple other things, the reason that Georgia won the game. And once again, from that conversation in Los Angeles, McClendon was more than happy to give his guys credit for stepping up when they really needed to. Once again, this is good stuff from Bryan McClendon.
Yeah, I think the guys that came out there and did a good job. We know, man, that we're responsible for way more than just catching the football. We're responsible for making sure, man, that we do our job. And we feel like if we do our job in general, whether it's catching or not, then that'll greatly impact the game. And I feel like, man, those guys have done a good job of embracing that and understanding that and wanting to be one of the pieces on why we go out there and play well. One of the
pieces of why we go out there and play well. I don't know how often in the past you've said, hey, the Georgia wide receiver is one of the big reasons that Georgia won this game. But against Ohio State at the end of last season, I think you would have said that. Arian Smith has the big breakaway play. Remember the Kearis Jackson catch that set up the game-winning drive there at the end? A.D. Mitchell has a couple nice moments for you. Marcus Rosemary-Jackson has a couple nice moments for you. Obviously, Brock Bowers, you talked about before, kind of a tight end, but nonetheless, kind of doing what he does. The point is, Georgia catching the football very well that day, and I think it sets us up for what's going to happen here for Georgia this year and the preview of that we get starting here this spring. This is probably the most exciting collection of wide receivers I think that Kirby Smart's ever brought back to start a year. Some of that are guys like Marcus Rosemary-Jackson and Ladd McConkey who are on last year's team. Some of that is a guy like Brock Bowers who's really a tight end but sort of functions like a wide receiver. Some of that's also two very big transfer additions like Dominic Lovett, one of the top pass catchers in the entire conference a year ago, and Ra Thomas in his own right, the leading receiver there for a Mike Leach offense in Mississippi State. This is a really fun crop of players. They are led by, I think, a very valuable part of the Georgia coaching staff in Bryan McClendon. We have not always talked about wide receiver at the forefront of the conversation about UGA football. But this year, that might feel a little bit different. This year, it might be a little bit more top of mind for us here as the wide receivers take center stage in a way they rarely have for the Dogs. But the brand new quarterback and a brand new offensive coordinator, this collection of wide receiver talent, it could be coming at a very good time. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're presented today by Breda Pest Management. We're happy to have you with us no matter how you get to us. Live on video, 9:45, 1st and 15, DawgNation.com, the DawgNation app. 10 a.m. after that, across all the video platforms, Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and Twitch. We're also available on the radio at noon each and every day on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, as a podcast as well, wherever you find them. World-famous DawgNation.com, Apple, Spotify, everything else in between. We're just really, really happy to have you as a part of our program. We try to make it as available to you as we can, and we're happy to be able to do that for you here today. All right, so big thanks to our friends at Breda Pest Management who make it all possible for you there as well. You've heard me tell you about Breda Pest Management before. They are the official pest control provider of UGA Athletics. That's a really, really important thing because the strength, the resource trusted by Georgia can be trusted by you too. That means you can get the same level of protection for your home as the Dogs get for Sanford Stadium and all the other athletic venues, protecting it from termites and bugs and critters and everything else. And let me tell you why that matters for you there as well, because a company like Breda, which has been in business since 1975, got 125 employees all over our market area taking care of folks with their pest control and their termite protection needs. That level of strength can be leveraged to save you money when you make the switch to Breda Pest Management. You may be working with a company that's raising your rate each and every year. That's obviously pretty annoying. Well, end that annoyance. Make the switch to Breda Pest Management and put more money back in your pocket just for making that decision. In fact, find out more about this yourself by checking out BredaPest.com. That's BREDA, BredaPest.com. And you can find out more about that. Great to have Breda Pest Management as a part of DawgNation Daily here today. All right, we're going to have Mike Griffith coming up as a part of DawgNation Daily here in a couple of moments. Prior to that, I want to go around the DawgHouse, and I want to talk a little bit about something that Mel Kiper recently said. You know, Kiper had his recent list of, hey, top, whatever he calls them, breakout performers at the NFL Scouting Combine, whatever else, and on a small list of names, two of those guys for Kiper were former Dogs. One of those was Stetson Bennett. By now you know a lot of what Bennett was able to do, and it's nice to see Bennett validate the on-field career he had at UGA with a nice scouting combine performance there as well. And he's not going to be taking first round or anything like that, but Bennett is solidly now proving himself to be an NFL draft pick. If it was a late-round pick before, it seems like he might be a little more of a mid-round pick right now, and a guy who I think Kiper awarded this way has a chance to have a long NFL career. This is a very nice, happy ending for a guy in Bennett who's been doubted at every turn. When you see how much Bennett has continued to prove in the face of the criticism that he's gotten, sometimes maybe even understand why at times he's a little edgy about some of this kind of stuff, because how could you not get frustrated after a while when all you do is perform well in the face of people assuming you're not going to be able to? And the scouting combine was another chance for Stetson Bennett to prove exactly that. And I believe that's exactly what he did. But it's another guy that Kiper mentioned from Georgia that I actually want to spend some time talking about here, because another one of Kiper's breakout performers, or whatever his phrasing was, kind of top names to mention, the guys that Kiper himself specifically wanted to highlight. One of those was former Georgia outside linebacker Nolan Smith. Now, we spent a lot of time last week talking about Nolan here on this show because Nolan had such a great press conference prior to his workout. His workout was fantastic. And I do believe that Nolan Smith definitely demonstrated that he should be one of the first 32 players taken. In fact, he may even be working his way up the first round ladder here right now. But nonetheless, really, really demonstrated a lot. And Mel Kiper had a lot of praise for Nolan Smith because of that. However, there's another phrase that Kiper kind of used in evaluating Nolan that I do think is worth us talking about here for a moment. And it's really more about Georgia than it is Nolan Smith, but the things that Kiper said about Nolan become a little bit of a springboard for some of this. Let me show you a couple of these sentences if you're watching on video, and obviously you're listening radio podcast. I'll just read it to you. Kiper saying of Nolan Smith that NFL teams covet edge rushers. It's one of the positions they'll reach for the most. In other words, they'll take a flyer and take a little bit of a risk on the edge rush position because that's how valuable sacking quarterbacks are in the eyes of the NFL decision men. He says Smith has all the physical tools teams want in an outside linebacker, but he had just 6.5 sacks over the past 2 seasons and too often got swallowed up by offensive tackles. He has to develop more pass rush moves. Now, I think that's a pretty fair evaluation of Nolan Smith. Nolan was a great player at Georgia. That greatness did not always get measured by the total number of sacks that he got. Obviously, in the NFL, they are drafting him to do the things he did for Georgia, but they also want more of that sack production for him there too. And we kind of know the challenge that Nolan dealt with. Nolan himself has been pretty honest about this, is that he's been critiqued because of his size, questioned because of his size. He's sort of always dealt with that as an edge rusher. But I kind of want to pull this out and make this be about Georgia just a little bit more. One of the things I have to acknowledge is that Georgia won the national championship last year, getting far fewer sacks than I ever would have imagined they would have been able to if they wanted to be able to win the national championship. Now, the caveat to that is that while Georgia on a sort of yearly basis wasn't necessarily dominant at rushing the quarterback, when it really needed to against Tennessee, that's exactly what it did. Even we mentioned the Ohio State game a little earlier. That's kind of a wild game, kind of played with nearly 90 total points, and yet Georgia still had, I think, 4 sacks there in that game, getting after quarterback when they really needed to against C.J. Stroud. Also a big part of why they won that game there as well. That when Georgia was to any degree challenged, they stepped up. They got after Hendon Hooker. They got after C.J. Stroud. They kind of got after quarterback when they needed to. But I do believe that Mel Kiper gives you a little bit of a template for how the Georgia defense in 2023 might be different than it was in 2022. I do believe, in the wake of some of what's being said about Nolan there, that Georgia's trying to get a little bit bigger at the edge rush spot. You look at a guy like Darius Smith Jr., who I think is going to have a chance to step up here for Georgia this year. That's an example of what might be the new wave kind of pass rusher to a place like Georgia. He's got the athleticism, but he's also got the long frame, and that might make it a little easier to shed some of these offensive tackles and get towards the quarterback. No one disputes that Georgia's gotten an incredibly valuable career from Nolan Smith, but you'd like the idea of, in the future, your 5 stars who kind of come through this the way that Nolan did, whether it be a Damon Wilson or eventually a Samuel Mpemba or someone like that, they're able to kind of match the kind of sack total that should go around, go along with, be connected to someone who has the obvious talent level of a guy like Nolan Smith. Now, I haven't had a chance to talk to Kirby Smart about this directly. You want to go back to last summer, I was at one of those press conferences, and speaking about the fact that in 2021, Georgia had darn near 50 sacks, how much of that did Georgia need to replicate in 2022? And, Kirby was saying at the time that when it comes to like sort of benchmark numbers and things like that, that wasn't something they obsessed over as much as maybe a guy like me in the media does. This is what Kirby said about that at the time.
There's not internally a goal. We don't put a sack goal. We put an effective quarterback goal. And we all know that's not fun for you guys because you want to talk sack totals. We want to talk batted balls, interceptions, knockdown, hurries. You affect the quarterback with multiple rushes. And, Robert Beal is having a quietly good camp, which is good for us. A lot of times these scrimmages get skewed. Now, last year was a outlier because of the front and the people we had. But these scrimmages get skewed because you take so many snaps. Pass rushing is an effort play. And a lot of sacks are what we call hustle sacks, effort sacks. You don't necessarily win. You give a great second effort. Well, there comes a point in the scrimmage today where they take so many snaps, nobody's fresh, and the offensive lineman stays in front of them. We didn't have – it reminded me of our old scrimmages where we didn't have great pass rush, not because we don't have pass rushers. We just didn't have the juice that we needed. And I can't say that it was like that last year, but it's been like that in years past.
So obviously Smart saying that around one of those summer scrimmages that he had seen. He was offering some evaluation of what he had seen in that press conference there. He used an interesting word. He says, hey, in 2021, our front was kind of an outlier because those guys could just come after you over and over and over again. And yet in 2023, I sort of get the impression that the Georgia defense, I'm not going to say it's going to be as good as 2021. That's a big statement to make when you haven't even seen, the first spring practice as of yet. But in terms of the tone with the way that which it plays, I think it could resemble 2021 a little bit more than it might resemble 2022. Georgia last year, when it really needed to use Smart's phrase, affect the quarterback, that's exactly what it did. But this year in 2023, you may see a defense that kind of brings back that relentless week-to-week pass rush the way that was a little more common back in 2021. That Georgia had a great player in Nolan Smith, but the next generation of kind of edge rusher, outside linebacker at UGA might be a little bigger, might be a little bit more of a formidable challenge for the offensive tackles asked to block it. And a Georgia team that knocked on the door of 50 sacks in 2021, along its way to its first national championship, may have a number somewhat similar to that, maybe, in 2023 as it goes for number 3. We'll have to wait and see how that plays out then. But fun to think about as Georgia makes a transition looking for a third straight national championship here this year. That is around the DawgHouse. And before I bring on Mike Griffith, I want to, speaking of offensive tackles, I want to tell you about a really fun thing we have going on with DawgNation that you have a chance to get involved with here right now. I introduced this to you yesterday. Your chance to get involved with this right now. We're calling this our Marlowe's Tavern Insider VIP Lunch. The great former Georgia offensive tackle John Stinchcomb, which, by the way, Mike Griffith had a thing at DawgNation.com the other day looking at previous Georgia players throughout history and their performance in the NFL Scouting Combine. Really nice numbers for John Stinchcomb in that. So we may have to talk to John about that next week when we see John here live on DawgNation Daily, or maybe you get a chance to talk to John about that in person if you're one of the winners for our VIP Insider Lunch. If you go to DawgNation.com, you see all the details about this. It's going to be Tuesday, March 21st, right there at the Marlowe's in Dunwoody. That's 1317 Dunwoody Village Parkway. Going to be at noon there for that. We're going to have 4 winners who each get to bring a guest for this exclusive VIP lunch. Going to be a lot of fun. If you go to DawgNation.com, you can learn more details. You've got until March 14th to register for your chance to win. We're going to notify the winners on March 15th. So get a little bit more time here, but the time to act on all of this is right now. So I hope you'll get involved and be a part of your chance to win a VIP Insider Lunch there at the Marlowe's in Dunwoody with myself and the true DawgNation Insider, John Stinchcomb. Going to be a lot of fun. Go to DawgNation.com for more details on that. All right, before we're done today, a former dog has found a new home. We'll tell you about that. Nick Saban is seemingly whining again. We'll talk about that there as well. And maybe some bad news for the Florida Gators. That never gets old. We'll do that too. It's all on the way. But for now, spring practice starting, NFL Combine over. Everything else going on around UGA football. Let's talk to Mike Griffith here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
We will say hello to Mike Griffith. Mike was obviously in Indianapolis for the NFL Scouting Combine last week, so I'm curious to sort of hear what Mike saw behind the scenes on all of that. So, Mike, why don't we start right there? A lot of us kind of followed some of this on television or through social media. It certainly seemed like it was a very a good week for a lot of former Dogs. What was your sense of having been there? What did you observe there on the scene, Lucas Oil Stadium, a venue that's been good to Georgia in the past?
Well, first of all, like you said, Brandon, there was a lot of good news. I mean, to have 12 Georgia guys there and the way they performed, I mean, Nolan Smith being a workout wonder and Darnell Washington and Broderick Jones, I mean, these are all guys that I believe, cemented first-round status. Of course, there were some off-the-field headlines with the Jalen Carter warrant and arrest. And, a lot of national media, it's almost like it's not news that Georgia has good football players. It's not news that they perform well. People expect that from Georgia. They were talking a lot about Jalen Carter and the football culture. That's what the national media was talking about. I think the Georgia folks that are local, that have been around the program, and Kirby Smart, there's a familiarity there. And they're not as quick to push the panic button, but the outside nation, they're looking at it from 10,000 feet. They had questions, and that's why Kirby did the interview with ESPN. Now, surface value, I thought, again, most everyone did well. Kenny and Chris Smith both ran those 4.6s, not ideal numbers. But remember, there's a lot of film and a lot of hay in the barn, and we don't want to become prisoners of the moment. It's not like programs or teams are going to suddenly just do a 180 on their evaluations. They may move a guy up a little bit or say this player is better than that player at the position. But truth is, Brandon, and I thought about this yesterday when I was doing the story on Jamari Salyer. Remember how he slipped to the 6th round last year? And we were like, what in the world is going on? That Jamari Salyer is going in the 6th, the medical. So what we don't know is what can hurt us, okay? Stetson Bennett looked fine on the field. Hey, we saw him score 6 touchdowns against TCU. I wasn't surprised. What really matters to Stetson Bennett is going to be the type of attitude that he had with the GMs and the coaches behind the scenes. Karis Jackson ran some good numbers. Nolan Smith was great. What really matters is what happened with the team doctors and the MRI machine behind the scenes. So there's much more going on at the Combine than meets the eye. But what met the eye, for the most part, was very good.
If I were to ask you, how many first-round picks do you believe that Georgia has? Because I believe now, post-Combine, I'm forced to conclude they'll probably have more first-round picks than I initially thought they would have. I remember having a conversation with somebody the other day, and I guess I took a pretty conservative stance on how many guys for Georgia I was quite confident would go in the first round. I believe my number has now gone up, so I'll give you a chance to answer this too. How many first-rounders do you believe that Georgia has?
Well, did you do a 7-3 centile before, Brandon? Is that what you're telling me? Were you a 7-3 centile in the draft? I'm going to say 4. I'm going to say 4 because I think, first of all, I don't think Jalen Carter is going to fall below 5. And I'd be shocked if he went below 10. For all the hullabaloo and headlines and noise, you sit there and let that guy get by. If he ain't in jail or if he's not facing felony charges, you're going to take a pass on him because he did something stupid and street race? I don't think so. So Carter is a lock, and for the lock for the first half. I think Broderick Jones is a lock. I think Nolan Smith will go first round, provided that MRI machine didn't give anybody bad vibes, as long as the medical was good. I think Darnell Washington is a first rounder, so I think you got 3 solid guys, and then I think either Nolan or Keeley goes in the first round. So I'm going to say 4 with the upside of 5, minimum 3.
Yeah, I think that's kind of where I am too. At one point in time, I thought they might only have 3, and now I believe there's a very strong chance they have at least one more than that, if not all 5 of these guys who've been kind of kicked around going in the first round. And on the subject of Jalen Carter for a moment, and listen, I realize there's an issue here that's far more serious than football, but we're a football show, so that's what I'm going to talk about here for a moment. You know, I think the issue for Jalen becomes the run on quarterback here, where, you know, the only thing it takes for Jalen to kind of fall in the draft a little bit is for teams to decide they like Will Anderson Jr., which is a possibility anyway. Anderson Jr. could be taken ahead of Jalen Carter. You know, even still, I mean, Will's obviously a big-time prospect here. So if teams decide they like Anderson more than Carter, which would have been a possibility anyway, and if there's this huge run on quarterbacks at the front of the NFL draft because of a Chicago trade or something like that, then that's really all it takes for Carter to kind of slide a little bit more. I agree with you. I don't believe he'll be taken outside the top 10. Could he fall outside the top 5? I think that's a possibility for the two reasons I just mentioned.
Fair point. You know, Anthony Richardson now is a curiosity. I know I said that teams didn't read too much into the Underwear Olympics, but he was no less than stunning. I mean, the guy did a 41.5-inch vertical and a 4.43. He threw the ball well. He's got a lot of ceiling. And I know it's confusing for some. They say, well, didn't Stetson Bennett beat this guy? Well, he did, but a 25-year-old Stetson Bennett versus a 20-year-old Anthony Richardson. Teams draft largely on potential. Brandon, listen to this. One time I heard this. I heard that it actually works against, and you can take it for what it's worth. I don't know that I subscribe to this, and recent drafts wouldn't suggest it. But I actually had an NFL guy tell me that it kind of works against a kid coming out of Alabama and Georgia in the sense that they see how these kids' ceiling is, right? Because they're getting coached up by Saban and Kirby. So what you see at Georgia and Alabama from this guy is probably pretty darn close to the ceiling, whereas every now and then you'll see a kid maybe from another school who possesses great athletic traits, and you think to yourself, you know what, there's more there. So that's kind of an interesting way of looking at it. The reason I'm using that analogy is because I think with Anthony Richardson, my thought is I see Steve McNair. And I don't know how many people are that old to remember, but when Steve McNair came out of Alcorn State, he was very accomplished, and he was older, but he hadn't played in an NFL-style system, and he wasn't quite ready for prime time when he first got to the NFL. Now, after some seasoning and some coaching, Steve McNair had Hall of Fame ability. I think the same could be true of Anthony Richardson. And I'll tell you one more quick story, and I know it's not your favorite person. I hope your stomach is settled for breakfast. but when I was talking to Steve Spurrier last week, I recalled a conversation that he and I had the year before about Anthony Richardson. And he told me what he told him. He told Richardson, you have more gifts, physical gifts, than any quarterback I've ever been around in my entire life. But you've got a lot to work on, son. That's what Spurrier told him. So the gifts are there. Will it translate? I don't know. And here's the other question. Do you want to use a first-round draft pick on a guy that may not be ready to play next season?
No.
So it's a curiosity to me. I'll be interested to see where Anthony Richardson goes. Will Levis as well. Scouts love him. You look at his interceptions last year, BA, they did a breakdown film. I mean, it looked like, you know, Jake Fromm 2019 with the receivers on the merry-go-round that Kirby talked about. Guys running the wrong routes, balls getting batted. I mean, what can this poor guy do? They love his measurables. He didn't run the 40, but believe it or not, he jumped higher than Stetson and longer. He was more explosive than Stetson in a bigger package. So athletically, he looks good. And then I think everybody would agree that Stroud and Bryce Young, to your point, both of these guys are going to go in the top 3, top 4, and does that trigger the run on quarterbacks? So that's kind of my view on the quarterbacks from 5,000 feet.
I got stuff I want to talk to you about, but let me just say this real quick, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because, like I said before, there are a couple things I want to hit with you. My philosophy here is, and it's been wrong before, but it's my prevailing philosophy, I'm not taking a guy that wasn't good in college, and Anthony Richardson just wasn't good in college. I know what he looks like. I know what he does in an event like the Combine, but he wasn't good. And, you know, Dan Mullen didn't even trust him to be the starter, which tells me something. Will Levis kind of the same way. Now, you can say what you want to about the Kentucky offense this year. Mike, I didn't think he was that great in a Liam Cohen offense in 2021 that had, a lot more wide receiver talent. I just didn't think he was that great. He wasn't very accurate then either. This is also a guy that failed to win the starting job multiple times at Penn State. I don't think Will Levis is very good. I don't think that Anthony Richardson is very good. Having to take one of those guys in the first round or take a guy like Stetson Bennett in the mid-round situation, I'd feel much better about a mid-round pick on Stetson Bennett than I would a first-round pick on a guy like Levis or Richardson. There are other quarterbacks in this draft I really like. Take Bryce Young, for instance. I think a team that drafts a Levis or a Richardson over a guy like Bryce Young, who proved it in college, I think you're just making a huge, huge mistake. Now, I would have said the same thing about Josh Allen. I turned out to be wrong. But outliers do not prevailing wisdom make. And in this particular case, I think the prevailing wisdom should work against guys like Levis and Richardson. I can't make that more clear.
Yeah, I can understand that. And a lot of people felt that way about Patrick Mahomes because who was he in college? But, it's always different, and everybody has a perspective that, there's no right or wrong answer, Brandon. I mean, my fear for Bryce Young, if he goes to the Texans, I don't care how many Wheaties he ate to get up to 205, that little guy's going to get killed behind that. I don't know who could go in. I don't think anybody could go into Houston and win. And we've seen really talented quarterbacks get ruined before by going to really poor teams. And I said this yesterday. I said, I think Bryce Young's better than Dak Prescott, but I don't think the Cowboys are going to fire Dak Prescott. That job's not open. So he's going to go to one of these poor teams without much protection and probably not have a very good rookie year. So it can work for you to go early, get a lot of money, but it can also work against you because in the long run, maybe that second contract's not as good or maybe you're exposed to more hits. And I don't think C.J. Stroud can handle it. I know he showed up and played really well against Georgia, but there were a lot of other opportunities for C.J. this year, I thought, particularly the Michigan game, where his mobility could have made a difference and it didn't. So I think he's showing up a little too late in the game for me. I think Bryce is probably too small for Houston. I think they ought to sit back and let the Bears take Jalen Carter number one. But, again, there's guys making a lot of money up there in the NFL. They're going to make these decisions. It sure is fun to talk about, though.
Let me transition here. Georgia spring practice begins next week. What stands out to you, things you're most interested in as the Dogs show up to work next week?
Well, there's a lot. I mean, the quarterback battle, obviously, is going to be fascinating. The offensive line, I wrote about Ernest Green today, Brandon, and, could Georgia really be starting a left tackle that hasn't ever played in a game? I mean, that it seems like such a stretch. The last few years, there's been such natural progressions into the next guy. This time, there's not. And I think a lot of Ernest Green, to be clear. I sat down with him in California when I was out there a couple years ago on a DawgNation football trip. And I'm so impressed with this kid. But still, I'll say this. The good news is the schedule is very forgiving for Georgia. Very forgiving schedule. A lot of runway to get up to speed. So much runway that I'm not even convinced that they'll be settled on a starting quarterback even after the season starts. You could see that quarterback battle go in 2 or 3 games into the season.
Yeah, I would kind of agree with that. I mean, I think you got the luxury to do that because of the schedule. Plus, we've seen, I think, teams do that before. And your point about Ernest Green's one that we also talked a little bit about yesterday there as well, because he was praised by guys like Broderick Jones and Bryan McClendon at the NFL Scouting Combine. And, Mike, what I said about that yesterday, and I'm thinking you'll probably agree with me on this, is that when you hear the same compliment from 2 different guys, I think you're forced to take that seriously. Because, listen, the Georgia players at the Combine are not going to trash their former teammates still at Georgia, right? They're going to just sort of say nice things no matter what. But when it's the same compliment, it's that specific praise, but the sort of specific thing, you take that seriously. And you're right. Green hasn't played. He's been injured. But he did show up last year apparently pretty polished because of his background, because of things like that. He showed up with a little seasoning to him to begin his college career. And I take some comfort in that because I do think that in all likelihood, he's going to be asked to be in a big role this year. Marius Mims has certainly played, but he's going to be a full season starter for the first time. Opposite him, I'm assuming it's going to be Ernest Green. Listen, most teams would obviously love to have the talent, even if it doesn't come with the experience. But as Georgia potentially kind of works him into this role, the fact that guys like Broderick and guys like Warren sort of thought he had a little bit of seasoning to his game when he showed up fresh out of high school, I at least take some comfort out of that.
Oh, for sure, as we should. his dad being a former NFL player and, the level of ball that he played out there in the Trinity League at St. John Bosco, which is just an amazing football factory. I think Georgia should feel good about it. I think that, again, internally, and I don't want to bang this drum too much, but I do think it's important. Unfortunately, one of the off-field incidents was the race incidents was Jamon Dumas-Johnson. And Brandon, I really think he's the heart and soul of this team. I really do. I think Cedric Van Pran on offense, I think it's so big that he came back in kind of a Jordan Davis way, not just with how good Cedric is, but the type of leader that he is. But defensively, I just don't think there's any question that Jamon Dumas-Johnson is absolutely the engine of this team, and how he responds to his off-field adversity is going to be very important because Georgia needs him to respond the right way. We're talking about a guy who has college football Hall of Fame potential. We're talking about a guy who will start in the NFL. We're talking about a guy that Roman Harper thought, and you were right there when he said it, said this guy's better than Nakobe Dean. I mean, that's how powerful Jamon Dumas-Johnson is, and all this off-field stuff the transgressions has to be cleared out, and your leaders need to emerge and lead the Georgia way. This is not a program that needs to run side by side with Urban Meyer's because 5 captains have been arrested in the last 16 months. That trend has to stop, and it has to stop with the most important and the biggest figure on the team, and that is Jamon Dumas-Johnson. So that's a guy that I can't wait to interview, to watch respond to adversity. This is a Kirby Smart special. Kirby's all about getting his guys to respond to adversity. Well, that applies off the field too. So I think we're going to see a different JDJ. I think this team is going to take on a different direction. I believe in Kirby Smart and his leadership techniques, and I think we'll see that applied this spring.
Let me squeeze in one more thing on a completely different topic before we let you go here. There has been some reporting over the last few days. Ross Dellinger from Sports Illustrated kind of led the way on this, that Georgia's third permanent opponent in the presumed 9-game conference schedule might not be who we thought it was going to be. Obviously, everybody knows in a sort of 3-game world, if you're playing the same 3 teams every year, Florida and Auburn are certainly likely to be Georgia's 2 permanent rivals. The third team there, those got in some debate. I think a lot of us assumed it would be South Carolina, but according to Ross Dellinger, it might actually end up being Kentucky for all kinds of unspecified reasons. What do you think of Georgia potentially getting that third team that's maybe not what some of us expected that it would be?
Well, I kind of buried the lead in my story on it the other day when I talked to the Georgia players at the Combine, and it was kind of funny, unexpected to see who the 3 teams were that they wanted. Only one of them. There's only 3 guys, just to be clear. They're all Georgia high school guys, though. Broderick Jones, Chris Smith, and who was the other one? What was the other Georgia guy I talked to there that weighed in on this? It's slipping my mind right now. They all agreed on Auburn. Broderick wanted Missouri in there. Oh, the other one was Kieris. Kieris wanted Alabama. Kieris wanted Alabama. He was the one that picked Florida. He wanted Alabama, Florida, and Auburn because he said they want to play the best. And that was their trend. Now, what I buried was I know I have a South Carolina source that told me that South Carolina doesn't want to play Georgia every year. That's why. Part of what's going on is everybody kind of submits their requests for the league. I remember talking to Greg McGarity about this one time a couple years ago about how this scheduling works. And everybody kind of shares what their wish list to the league, and then the league has to kind of decipher it. South Carolina doesn't want to play Georgia every year. That's why you're seeing Kentucky. It's unfortunate because I think Kentucky is the pits. I think it's a terrible road trip. I think it's a terrible opponent because they're good enough to be tough, and you should get some respect for beating them, but nobody gives them that respect, and nobody wants to go to Lexington in November, or I guess for anything but horse races or basketball. It's just not, it's just not.
Yeah, a trip to Lexington in October is very different than a trip in November. I think there are a lot of people who like the October trip when the Keelan thing's still running. When it gets to be cold in November, that's when people don't want to go to Lexington.
Nobody wants to go to Lexington. So, but that's why, Brandon, South Carolina does not want to play Georgia, and so they'll get their wish list. Now, part of what's going on here, and you mentioned Nick Saban, and I do understand why he would look at it and say, wait a minute, we're getting LSU, we're getting Auburn, we're getting Tennessee. That's a pretty good. Here's the deal. they're getting LSU, Tennessee, and Auburn because guess who pays the bills? They want to see Alabama play those teams. That's what ESPN wants to put on TV. There's a price that comes with greatness. And part of it for Nick Saban, as he's counting his money and looking in his bank account, is his responsibility to the league. And Alabama does make the SEC more valuable, just as Georgia does. So you better believe, Brandon, and I don't, Greg Sankey's a guy I've got a ton of respect for, but you better believe that those television executives, have their hand in the cookie jar here, and they will wield some influence, I believe.
Mike, good stuff. Thanks for being here. We'll look forward to talking to you very, very soon. Of course, spring practice next week. Thanks for being here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management.
Thanks, B.A.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
A little behind the scenes inside baseball here for a moment. We try our best to operate this as if it's a real show. Some days maybe we succeed, sometimes maybe we don't, but we try our best to kind of, comport ourselves with a certain degree of professionalism, which means we don't like to have a lot of errant sounds around here. Yesterday I did not properly edit an audio clip, and so you had a little bit of the next question when it's only supposed to be just the one self-contained clip. That's an error, every now and then you make one. But we try not to have a lot of random noise showing up on the show, which means when we say goodbye to a guest, we do take these guests via phone oftentimes. Sometimes we'll do it via Zoom, but a lot of our guests happen via phone. And we like to sort of end the phone call without, the dial tone, for instance. And with most of our guests, that's, for whatever reason, just very easy to do. Our producer, Michael Carvel, always remarks about the fact that there is no one capable of hanging up a phone quicker than Mike Griffith is, because Michael's got his finger on the button. This is like one of those sort of Wild West, gunslinger showdowns where, Michael's trying to hang up on Mike Griffith before Mike can hang up on us. But I don't believe any week it's ever happened. You always get that little bit of boop, the little dial tone there at the end because, Mike, he's just so ready to get off the phone, I guess. He's, clicking that thing and he's gone. So, funny stuff nonetheless. Let me transition. Let's get ready to go cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Nobody hanging up on Royal Caribbean. Everybody looking forward to a great time, including us, this upcoming April. That's actually, I feel like I've been saying, April, 2023 for such a long time. Y'all, that's like a month away. It's here. It is here. It is going down. And we are going to be a part of it. And man, oh man. Some of y'all are going to roll your eyes when I say this, but I know I just got back from vacation. I sort of feel like I could use a vacation again. Do you ever have that thing where, you go on vacation, it's a great time, you're thankful for it, then you come back, and then, 2 weeks later, boy, I need another vacation. But thankfully, I get one. Although this is going to be hanging out with all of you on board Independence to Sea. So I'll be working to make sure that all of you have a good time. Nonetheless, it's going to be great. Jessica Slater, the one that's helped us out with all this great travel agent. You can call her 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. Also, royaldogs.com website she's put together to get you ready for all this. At this point in time, it may be a little late to get on board the Dog Nation cruise, but you can learn all about the great stuff that Royal Caribbean has going on a regular basis, including Wonder of the Seas, which I was just on. Or, you can kind of decide for yourself, what's better for you. I just took a 7-night cruise on board One of the Seas. Our Dog Nation cruise is going to be a 4-night cruise. I am lucky enough later on this June, we're going to take a 3-night cruise. So if you want the 3-night cruise that kind of just takes place over the weekend, or you want the 4-night cruise that, hey, maybe does it full, because listen, at this time of year, you got baseball, all these kinds of things going on. You've got these obligations that maybe make it hard to get away for a full week. Well, Royal Caribbean can kind of accommodate you on some of those shorter sailings. And a lot of those shorter sailings going out of Port Canaveral where I like to sail out of, you're talking about a Independence of the Seas or a Mariner of the Seas. These are very, very large, very cool ships that have a lot of amenities and a lot of fun things to enjoy on board. So just a great time to explore all the great stuff going on with our friends at Royal Caribbean. All right, with that said, let's get ready to go cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. There is news today involving a former Dog as Jaheim Singletary, former 5-star cornerback signee for the class of 2022 with Georgia. Singletary on his way now to Alabama. Now, here's what I think is interesting about Jaheim at Georgia. This is one of those guys that, listen, he may go on to be the next Deion Sanders, right? He may just be great. You did not hear a ton about him during his 1 year at Georgia. I'm not, speaking ill of him on his way out the door, but it's one of those things that seems like a guy like Dalen Everett probably just earned a little bit more buzz, a little bit more curiosity during his first year than a guy like Singletary did. So maybe the change of scenery at a place like Arkansas will serve Jaheim pretty well here. You always called Jaheim's nickname was Slim Singletary, which is kind of a cool name. But I do believe that smaller frame probably did not do him any favors at a place like Georgia. At a place like Arkansas, we'll see how that works out for him. I think it's a good addition for Arkansas. I think one of the stories in the SEC here, and now y'all maybe heard me say this before, I'm a Sam Pittman homer. I openly root for Arkansas to win games because I just like Sam Pittman. I do think this is a very tricky year for Arkansas this year. You've got two brand new coordinators, and I'm not sure that either guy is necessarily a change for the better. In fact, I'm pretty sure that Kendall Briles out, Dan Enos in on the offensive side of the ball for Arkansas is probably a net negative. On the defensive side of the ball, though, Travis Williams, the new defensive coordinator there. You know Travis, guy's been in Auburn, places like that. He steps in place of Barry Odom, who becomes head coach at UNLV. That's the guy that Singletary's going to get a chance to work with here, at least as his defensive coordinator. And I do believe there's a chance that Williams could provide a defensive upgrade. I just think that Barry Odom at Arkansas was playing a little bit too soft of a style. I just think they were, and some of that was kind of dependent on the talent Arkansas had in the program at the time. But I think that Arkansas needs a little bit more aggressive defense, and maybe Travis Williams has a chance to provide that, and certainly adding a big-time talent, at least by the basis of the recruiting ranking like Singletary, probably a good thing for Arkansas here. So Singletary's not at Georgia. You knew you'd lose some transfers at a place like Georgia. If you lose any transfers, they're likely to be former elite recruits because that's really all Georgia has. Singletary is one of those guys. Took him a while to kind of sort of figure out where his home was going to be, but now it is official. He is going to Arkansas, and new defensive coordinator Travis Williams gets a chance to work with him there. The other day we saw the quote from Nick Saban about the permanent opponents from Sports Illustrated. This, I guess, a part of a wider ranging conversation where Nick Saban kind of talks about a lot of different things. He sort of on the idea of shortening the game, something that people seem to be pretty serious about right now. Key NCAA decision makers, he's had some things to say about that. He had some things to say about NIL. I'll read this quote to you. The question from Sports Illustrated was, NIL scene is evolving quickly, collectives popping up everywhere, distributing millions to athletes. What are your thoughts on the situation? Saban says, the issue is when you create those collectives for people, are you establishing pay-for-play type environment that can be used in recruiting? So now all of a sudden guys are not going to school where they can create the most value for their future. Guys are going to school where they can make the most money. He says, I don't think that's the best thing, even the best thing for the player. He says, you went to college, I went to college. Why were you going? We had goals and aspirations for how we wanted to create value for our future, Saban says. He goes on to say some other things. I realize in some respects that kind of thing for Saban is going to get painted in a bad light. And one of the frustrating things about when it comes to Nick Saban NIL, he just sort of seems to say whatever fits the room he's in the moment. Like, he doesn't seem to have a lot of consistency with thought when it comes to his NIL. One day he's paying Bryce Young allegedly $1 million. The next day he's not paying anybody anything. He just sort of seems to change with whatever mood he's in at the given moment. A little bit more consistency from such an important figure would probably be valuable for college football. But I do think that Saban is touching on something that's probably more important than it'll be treated as, and some people kind of roll their eyes at this, but I don't think that Saban's necessarily wrong when he says, if you make a short-term money decision with your college future, you are probably making a mistake. Because even if it's a very big payment in the NIL world we live in now, because 90% of the stuff that you've heard, rumors, report, things like that, are just totally bogus. So let's say it's like $500,000. That's a lot of money to me, probably to you. Some of y'all are rich. That may not sound like as much money to you, but even if you're rich, $500,000 is still kind of a lot of money. But guess what? I don't care what your situation is. $500,000 is still not going to last you your entire lifetime when you're 18 years old. So you got to be really careful on an enormous sum of money at 18 in comparison to the kind of development as a player that can set yourself up for lifetime income. And, let's say it's school A, school B. School A's offering me $500,000, but school B has a better track record of turning its players into millionaires. I think that's more valuable than the NIL short-term thing. I think it is, and a wise thinking person, I think, would come to the same conclusion. So, Nick Saban sort of sounds like the old man on the porch here a little bit, complaining about NIL, but in this particular situation, I do think his word should be taken somewhat seriously. And then finally there's this. It has been a tumultuous offseason for Florida, and I think quite possibly another example of this. Florida fans not happy today. I believe they have a right to be. You may remember Jamar Chaney. At one point in time, Jamar Chaney was on Georgia's recruiting radar. Ended up Mississippi State. He's also been working as a quality control analyst at Florida. And if you follow like the recruiting, like the deep soap opera on recruiting, I think a lot of you would probably know that Chaney has been credited with some pretty big recruiting wins for Florida. That some of the small number of relationships they have had with elite recruits, that Chaney's been kind of a factor in a lot of those. He's been in kind of that analyst role, but now he's leaving Florida, allegedly, reportedly, to go become an on-field coach at Western Kentucky. So a lot of Florida fans do not view this as a positive because of the fact that even though he wasn't an on-field coach, he'd been having success in the Florida recruiting ranks, and now he's going to Western Kentucky to kind of begin his on-field coaching career. And a lot of Florida fans are thinking, well, if that's what he's going to do, then why don't you give him a job here? In some respects, this reminds you a little bit of some of the hullabaloo that existed a couple of years ago around Nick Williams, when Williams was working as an analyst for Georgia and ended up leaving to go to Texas A&M. But the difference is that Nick Williams would have maybe been a defensive line coach. Georgia's defensive line coach at the time was Trey Scott, one of the absolute best in the entire country. Of course, Trey remains here to this day. So in Georgia's case, you had a guy like Nick Williams who seemingly was a valuable analyst and a pretty important part of your recruiting apparatus, but there was nowhere to put him on the on-field coaching staff because all you had were elite-type guys in your coaching ranks, just nowhere to put him. In the case of Florida, that is not thought to be the situation here, where it's not like Jamar Chaney, can't get the spot there on the Florida roster because of all the great coaches they have ahead of him. The truth is, they don't seem to have a very distinguished coaching staff right now. A lot of those guys have also left over the course of this year. In fact, Florida just had to promote one of its quality control analysts to tight ends coach. A lot of Florida fans saying, we're going to do that for this, guy who's relative nobody. How come you can't do that for Jamar Chaney, who a lot of Gators fans have grown to like? So the point of all of this is, the moral of the story is, more turmoil down at Florida, an offseason of transition and not seemingly change for the better for a first-year coach in Billy Napier that had really nothing to show for his first 12 months on the job, moving into a kind of a pressure-packed second year where a lot of programs do take that next step. But Florida right now can't seem to figure out what its staff is going to look like for next year, and that does not bode well for its on-field performance either, and happily will make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And I say happily because anytime you can close with a little bit of bad news for Florida, for Gator haters around here, that is never a bad thing. Let me tell you something else that's not a bad thing. That is the finished long drink, because as you head towards the weekend, of course, on Fridays on our show, we kind of showcase the finished long drink as a part of our big finish, the big finish to the week, courtesy of the finished long drink. We want you to be a part of that. So if you're enjoying some finished long drink, it's been great weather lately. So I know a lot of y'all are out there on the golf course or hanging around the pool or things like that. In fact, I've even seen some pool stuff going on here as of late. Weather been warm enough to be able to do that. Finished long drink, of course, accompanies all of that very, very well. So as you're enjoying that, let us know. Share it with us. Hit us up online, thelongdrink.com. That's the Long Drinks website. If you hit them up, I won't say that. But you can hit me up on Twitter at DawgNation Daily or something like that. Showcase yourself enjoying some finished long drink, and then we'll showcase you as part of our big finish coming up on Friday. If you're hearing all of this and you're like, well, BA, I hear you talk, but the finished long drink, I still don't know what it is. Well, go ahead and try some today. You can get that 8-can variety pack and try 2 different cans of each of the 4 finished long drink varieties, or you can go online, thelongdrink.com, and sort of try to decide which variety seems good for you. Long drink cranberry, long drink traditional, it's the blue can, got the citrus flavor, the gin kick. Long drink strong, 8.5% alcohol by volume. Long drink zero, no carbs, no sugar. Whichever long drink variety you think you might like, there is an option out there for you. And if you go to thelongdrink.com, you can figure out where you can try some today. And to wrap things up, how about a golden shoe? We talked a lot about quarterback yesterday and the mystery that might surround whether or not Carson Beck really does ascend to the starting role, as you might expect him to after being the number 2 quarterback a year ago. Or if we hear from one of the other potential contenders for this job, a guy like a Brock Vandagriff or a Gunnar Stockton. Well, one of our viewers, Ryan Walker, has weighed in on the side of Carson Beck and all of this. Ryan writing in, it's time for the Duval County Bandit, which is actually a great nickname. The Duval County Bandit to take the Dogs and college football by storm. In Beck we trust, he says. And then he has his graphic there. In Beck we trust, natty or bust, 3-peat on deck. So strong stuff from Ryan Walker. Casting his lot in support of Carson Beck, and we'll give him a golden shoe for doing that. We'll also remind you, lousy, stinking Gators, coaching staff a total mess, recruiting effort in shambles, and 234 days right now, they get beaten up by Georgia again. That is our Gatorator countdown. We will see all of you tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. And on video. Time now for the R.S. Andrews cool down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They will show up on time, do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. All right, we're going to try to keep this to 15 minutes today because Jeff's coming in. He's got some stuff that he's working on. So I'm going to try to make way for him. And we're going to try to do it hard, do it well, and do it quick. 15 minutes from right now, getting off the air. Starting on YouTube. Have not started there the last couple of days. So let us go there to get there. B. Ace Cardigan says, so who's going to be our three constant teams? What Dellinger, I believe, is the one that's reported, is Florida, Auburn, as you'd expect, the third team being Kentucky. Now, interesting caveat to that. So when I was a kid, this is the 80s. I was a child in the 80s. Back then, the SEC only had 10 teams, and you only played 6 conference games. And of the 6 teams that Georgia always played, Kentucky was one of them. So Georgia, there's a long history there. They are not rivals, but it is a long continuous series. So in that respect, maybe it makes some sense. Mike said he had some reporting that said South Carolina did not want to play Georgia. I guess I'm somewhat surprised by that because I thought they would, but maybe having to play Clemson every year. See, here's the problem with South Carolina. And like on the one hand, they don't really have much of history with anybody. And I say this, I actually, I don't hate going to Williams-Brice Stadium. I don't hate the Georgia-South Carolina. I'll call that a little bit more of a rivalry. I don't hate that necessarily. But the issue that South Carolina has is that South Carolina doesn't really have a meaningful game with really anybody in the SEC. That's a hard thing for them. They don't have with, like, say, Tennessee, what Kentucky has with Tennessee. They don't have with Florida what, maybe other teams have with Florida. They just don't really have that. And while South Carolina's got a big fan base and occasionally you get pretty good recruiting wins, and I think that Shane Beamer's actually done a really good job there the last couple of years, it is true that there are only a small handful of teams in any given year. I'm talking about SEC teams here. There are only a small handful of teams that South Carolina has any chance of being a point spread favorite against. South Carolina wins some SEC games, but there are just not, like go 3 years into the future. Take random South Carolina team, random Tennessee team. Who's likely to be the point spread favorite? History would suggest it's likely to be Tennessee. South Carolina, Ole Miss. Who's likely to be the point spread favorite? In different years it kind of works out differently, but recent history would suggest a random South Carolina team, a random Ole Miss team. Ole Miss likely to be the point spread favorite. There just aren't a lot of teams in which South Carolina has a ton of history with, or a lot of teams in which South Carolina is obviously better than in most years in the SEC. So what that tells you is, on the one hand, hey, Gamecocks fans like their rivalry with Georgia. I believe they view Georgia as their second biggest rival and their most important SEC rival. But on the other hand, as you transition to what is likely to be a 9-game conference schedule, the most important thing for South Carolina here is they are looking for wins. They need wins on a schedule that's likely to get tougher because you're not playing the rest of the SEC East on a yearly basis anymore. So if it is true that South Carolina did not want to play Georgia yearly, that might be the reason why. I also think it's kind of somewhat ironic. Go back to a year ago, slightly less than a year ago, last May, SEC spring meetings, the one team that we sort of have on the record reporting being against the 9-game conference schedule was Kentucky, because Kentucky also understands, hey, if we lose a non-conference game, have to play another SEC game, in a lot of years, that's going to be the difference in making a bowl or not. And all of a sudden, what we can kind of tout as a successful season, that becomes much more difficult to do. So Kentucky was on the record, at least there was reporting on the record that said Kentucky didn't want the 9-game conference slate. Well, not only do they get that, according to recent reports, they may get Georgia each and every year. So deal with that up there in Lexington, I guess. Let's see what else. Buzzy Glizzy says, do you think that Beck's going to have more single-season passing yards than Stead did last year? I guess if I was going to bet on that, I would bet against that. Assuming that Carson Beck's the starter, first of all, I would bet on less passing yards. I think that Georgia was in the top 15 nationally when it comes to passing yards last year. I believe passing yards per game. That's a really high total. That's a really high total. And that is a big outlier compared to most Georgia seasons. So if I had to bet, I'd bet against fewer yards. No disrespect to Carson, whoever ends up being the starter, but I'm assuming there are probably fewer passing yards to go around. Spencer Clark says replace South Carolina with Oklahoma, but the South Carolina game holds some deep roots. I think a lot of what you say makes a lot of sense, and this also kind of goes to the debate about, well, who should your permanent opponents be and who gets the tough draw. In most years, Georgia's going to be a tough draw no matter what, but take Oklahoma here and compare them to, say, Tennessee, because Nick Saban was complaining supposedly about having to play Tennessee each and every year. But let me ask a question. I'm not trying to be snarky. I'm trying to be serious. Does Tennessee represent a tough draw? Because Tennessee is good right now, but they've been pretty bad over the last 20 years. So what matters, the preponderance of history or like the present tense for something that might be in place for 5 or 10 years into the future? I don't really know how you answer that, because Oklahoma is the exact opposite on this. Oklahoma has been very good for most of the last 20 years, but they weren't good last year. So does that represent a tough draw for the next 10 years or an easy draw for the next year? In other words, if you wanted to give a team an easier schedule, who would you give them, Oklahoma or Tennessee? If you wanted to give a team a tougher schedule, who is the tougher foe? Is it Tennessee because they're good right now, or is it Oklahoma because they've been good more over the course of the last couple of decades? I don't quite know how you answer that, which to me sort of speaks to, there may be a Georgia, Alabama, probably even an LSU, the three teams you sort of least want to play on a yearly basis, and there may be teams like Vanderbilt that you most want to play on a yearly basis, but everything else is somewhat, I guess, in the eye of the beholder, I think. Let's see what else. Fred Gunn says that's just the newest thing for Nick to whine about, which is pretty true. Taylor Russell also calling for every quarterback to get a game early in the season. I'd kind of be fine with that. I mean, if nothing else, as kind of a hype man, I'm kind of a pro wrestling guy. If you wanted to, like, what if I told you George was playing Tennessee Martin? What if I told you Brock Vandegrift was starting against Tennessee Martin? Does that make that game more interesting? I'd say it probably does. Now, I'm not saying that Kirby Smart should make his coaching decisions on the basis of what's good for marketing. I'm certainly not suggesting that, but that is good marketing. If I told you, Ball State, Georgia's playing Ball State, but what if I told you Gunnar Stockton was playing Ball State? Would that make you more interested in that game? I'm thinking it probably would. Same thing for the Carson Beck debut against whichever one of those, also Rans he might, do that against. Then all of a sudden, these very, very uninteresting games, I believe, are made more interesting if it's the Brock Vandegrift debut, if it's the Gunnar Stockton debut, if it's the Carson Beck debut. Those games, I believe, made more interesting because of that. Raleigh Dog with a very, very scary notion for the rest of college football that last year might have been a rebuilding year for Georgia. In some respects, I don't think that's crazy, as funny as it sounds. Let's see what else. Dan in Arkansas says the 10-year average they're using, because they are using some like consulting firm to help them with this. He says it should be weighted, I should say, using the last 3 years. Maybe so. Maybe that's the case. I don't know that I fully agree with that, but maybe so. I also believe that we make a very big deal about the permanent opponents right now, and when it comes to preserving rivalries, I think you should. But when it comes to overall balance of schedule, I don't think it probably matters all that much, just from the standpoint that you're going to be playing every team in the SEC every other year. And every 4 years, you'll be traveling to every SEC venue. And every SEC team, theoretically, will travel to your stadium as well. So I think ultimately we may forget who the permanent opponents really are, because most of this is not like an NFL schedule where your 3 division opponents you play twice. That's 6 of your games against the same teams. You go home and away there each and every year, and there's extra weight given to those division opponents because winning a division is the easiest way to make the playoffs. In other words, your 3 permanent opponents in an SEC schedule are going to have far less significance than your division opponents in an NFL schedule, because the SEC is going to select the teams with the 2 best records to play for the conference title. So this is interesting now because it's new, but ultimately 3-4 years from now, I don't think the permanent opponent part of this discussion has a whole lot of relevance and a whole lot of weight on how the actual hierarchy in the SEC is determined. That's my belief anyway. Senior Dog 54 says the National Indoor Track and Field Championships this weekend. Georgia's got some strong entries. That's good to know, Senior Dog. Help us stay up to date on that. Tom says, is it too early to push Brock Bowers to the Heisman? I don't think it's too early. I think that Bowers is a legitimate Heisman contender. I do. Johnny Surfdog says, please appreciate that Beck worked hard, waited 3 long years in Athens, and has stayed loyal and didn't transfer. He deserves every chance in the world to start for us in 2023. It's a terrible precedent to not reward that loyalty. Support Beck. Yeah, I don't know that I necessarily agree with all of that. Now, Carson Beck may turn out to be the very best quarterback in this program, and his experience may serve him well. Ultimately, that's what I believe, is that Beck's experience, having been here for 3 years, that doesn't oblige Georgia to start him. It's the weapon that Beck might have that makes him the starter. That becomes a tool that he can use to show himself to be better than Gunnar Stockton and Brock Vandagriff. But I don't believe it creates an obligation for Georgia to make him the starter. It just might be the sort of the trump card that kind of proves that Beck's supposed to be the guy. You know, what Georgia needs to do is just sort of elect the best dude. That's what Georgia needs to do. Because if you select less than the best quarterback, you run the risk of kind of damaging your locker room culture anyway. That players are seeing what's going on here. They'll know who the best is, or at least they'll have their strong opinions about that. And so ultimately the obligation the coaches have is to select the best guy. It may end up being Carson Beck. His experience may be the reason why. But what we really, I believe, should want from the Georgia coaches is just their commitment to select the best, whoever it might be, and I believe that's what you'll get. I mean, I understand being grateful that Beck didn't transfer. I do understand that. But, you know, ultimately, this is about selecting the best guy, and Carson may be it. Let's see what else. On Facebook. K. Jackson Tolbert says, I think that loyalty should give a very slight edge. I'd be okay with that. I think in this particular case, loyalty might buy him the first rep with the first team on the first day of spring practice, and maybe that holds over for a little while. In other words, I think visually you may be seeing some evidence that guys like Gunnar and Brock, being below him in the depth chart, have some ground to make up here. But, I mean, these are guys that also showed loyalty to Georgia too. You know, Gunnar came knowing these other guys were here. That's valuable quarterback depth. Vandagriff also could have transferred and didn't. So, you know, Beck may have showed loyalty longer, but in some form or fashion, all three of these quarterbacks have shown some loyalty to UGA. Let's see what else. Jamie Huff just wants to make the quarterback competition fair, which is, I believe, probably a reasonable expectation. Joe Moody says, play the quarterback that gives us the best chance to win them all again, which is obviously the kind of thing that most people agree with. And it also kind of springs back to a comment that I made the other day, which is because of the unique situation Georgia finds itself in, they may evaluate this quarterback competition, and this is just speculation. They could potentially evaluate it slightly different than maybe other programs might. Whereas, let's say that youngest quarterback, oldest quarterback were very, very close in terms of winning the starting job. For some programs, in most situations, they might be tempted to take the younger quarterback in that situation because they could develop him for a longer period of time in the hopes of being really good one day in the future. Whereas a place like Georgia, they might handle it that way. But there's also a chance because of the fact that Georgia is kind of only judging itself by winning national championships right now, that Georgia might be a little bit more tempted to make a short-term decision. And, you know, part of that's just sort of embracing the reality of, hey, guys are transferring all the time anyway, that all of those factors could somewhat influence how a quarterback decision like this kind of plays itself out. Ryan Walker in our Facebook comment section here, basking the globe, winning another golden shoe here today. Ryan's a very funny and talented guy. Let's see what else. Barry Watkins says the problem is that Brock Vandagriff is interviewing for another team here right now this spring, meaning showcasing his abilities and maybe transferring. Listen, that may work. That may play itself out like that. I just think you have to have thick skin about all of that. The players have to have thick skin because they all believe they should start, and in some form or fashion, Georgia's about to tell one of these players, or a couple of these players maybe, Georgia's about to tell somebody they're wrong. So if you're the player, you're going to ask them to have thick skin about that. But I think if you're the program, you have to have thick skin about the idea of, well, if I do truly believe I'm better than what you think I am, then I'm going to go somewhere else and try to prove it. And that's just the way the door swings. And I just don't think you can get too worked up about that. I really don't. You just have to hope you make a good decision. And whatever happens for somebody else, if they move on, that's their business. But I don't think you can manage this quarterback competition as a way of playing defense fully against a transfer. Now, you'd be foolish to come out here and make somebody mad right away because that's just inviting, a situation like that. But managing the whole thing as some sort of elaborate attempt not to get somebody to transfer, I don't think that's the right way to do this because it might slow you down towards evaluating who really is the best. And if your actions are that easily telegraphed, then the players who are involved are going to see through it anyway. So that is that. Denise White-Loper says they need to listen to Nolan Smith's interview, and that's probably true. For anybody contemplating a transfer, you should at least consider what Nolan Smith said because, as we pointed out, in a place like Ole Miss right now, there are 3 former transfer quarterbacks. Jackson Dart came from USC. Spencer Sanders came from Oklahoma State. Walker Howard came from LSU. All 3 of those guys left their other place, presumably because they thought the grass was going to be greener somewhere else. But 2 of those guys are likely not to be playing at all here this upcoming season. So there are plenty of transfer quarterbacks who transfer and just don't play very much. And so you got to be thinking about that. Barry Watkins said, am I going to be comfortable watching Brock Vandagriff play for Auburn? I mean, I'm not comfortable with anything like that. But in the very near future is a guy that we, liked when he signed at Georgia, who Georgia has spent some time developing. In the very near future is a guy like that going to be probably playing against Georgia? I mean, it just sort of stands to reason they probably will be. Sort of stands to reason that's probably true. Matt Rugavina says we've got 0 history with Kentucky. It's a 7-hour drive versus 3 for South Kakalaki or Tennessee. If we get them, what a crock. It is a farther drive. It is a farther drive. And that is kind of frustrating. I would agree with you on that, given the closer. I think Matt's actually making a pretty good point. I don't think I've probably articulated that as well earlier as I could, is you are definitely trading a team like Tennessee or South Carolina, which is a very easy drive, for a situation like Lexington, which is just a lot longer trip. That's probably a fair point. Now, there are going to be plenty of teams that have permanent opponents that are not necessarily all that close, but that's an example of not really considering much in the way of geography. All right, it's 11:17, so I'm already overdue. But let me do one more trip around the comment section, then we're done. Tim Grubb predicting the Georgia win over LSU tonight in the SEC basketball tournament. I hope you're correct about that. That'd be nice to see. Let's see what else. Spencer Clark also points out something really important here, that when it comes to a guy like Mac Jones in Alabama, in 1 year he proved himself worthy of being a first-round pick. That his patience, after having really been the number 2 quarterback that Bama signed in 2017 along with Tua Tagovailoa, actually really worked out. So we've got examples of patience not just being a thing to do out of loyalty, but a thing to do out of, protecting your self-interest as well. Good point. Taylor Russ on the subject of Dylan Raiola. There's been a little bit of that USC chatter out there. We'll ask Jeff on Friday how real that is. We saw him with Peyton Woodyard recently, but it seems like there has been some chatter out there for sure. Dan in Arkansas says with only 3 prime quarterbacks in the room, we should be trying to keep as many as possible. I think that Georgia will try to keep all 3. I think there's only so much you can do about that, though. Johnny Surfdog also says, I thought that Beck looked amazing when he played. Those passes were accurate. They were lasers. I can't wait to see him as a starter. I think there's a lot to be excited about there, too. He said I'm going to be frustrated if they try to not come up with some sketchy reason to deny him the starting position here this year. So that's where I disagree. I agree with everything you said at that point in time, but the idea that the only thing that would prevent Georgia from starting Beck, and your idea is some sort of sketchy reason, I mean, I do have to say that I think that Beck is a far more unproven commodity than you do on the basis of some sort of short, small sample size. I just have to think that's the case. Carson Beck may be great, but Carson Beck is totally unproven. And Carson Beck being more proven than Vandagriff or Stockton, if that's true at all, it's only true by a small degree. That I believe what you really have is 3 unproven players one of which in Beck has slightly more experience. But all three are unproven, I believe. I just don't think that Carson Beck is anywhere near as much of a sure thing here, both to win the job and to thrive if he does win the job, as you're suggesting there. DT asks, at what point does UGA finally get what it wants? I think from a scheduling standpoint, it's getting 2 of the 3. Like, Georgia wants to play Auburn every year, and that's the closest drive in the SEC, at least one of the 2 closest. And then Georgia, Florida every year, whether it's played in Jacksonville or played on campus. So Georgia's getting 2 of the games that it wants. It's just not maybe getting all 3 of the games that it wants. And that's going to probably be pretty consistent for most people. You're going to get 2 of what you want, and you're going to probably have to sort of suck it up a little bit on the 3rd. That's probably what's true for Alabama, because I think the one that Saban was probably the most upset about was LSU. He knows he's playing Tennessee. He knows he's playing Auburn. He beats those teams anyway. But it's playing LSU every year that might have kind of gotten Saban's ire up a little bit. Back over here on Facebook before we go. Mike Nash going back to the 2013 LSU game, speaking of former Georgia guys playing against you. That was one of the great games ever played in Sanford Stadium. Mettenberger for LSU, the former Georgia quarterback, against Aaron Murray. What a shootout that was. Really, really was. Let's see what else. And by the way, I'm going to say the same thing. Jamie Huff talking about a little bit more of a negative appraisal for Carson Beck. I think that's also the same thing I said a moment ago is true for the good and the bad. Be careful assuming you know what he is for the positive based on a small sample size. Be careful what you think you might know on the negative based on a small sample size there as well. For the most part, Carson Beck is just an unknown commodity at the moment. He's been here for a while, but he's still an unknown commodity. We're going to find out a lot more over the course of the next few weeks, certainly the next couple of months, and probably into the start of the 2023 season. It'll be at that time, though, that we really learn what Carson is kind of all about. Jay Harwell also pointing out that Stetson Bennett kind of proves the patient theory as well, and that's very true. We got to go. Bill Sanders says, I think that Beck transfers if he doesn't win the starting job. Yeah, the guy that'd be most likely to transfer if he wasn't named starter would obviously be Carson Beck, because he's the guy that's been waiting the longest. Now, some of y'all may say, well, the actual most likely transfer is actually somebody different, because if you assume that Beck wins the job, you'd say, well, maybe Vandegrift's most likely to transfer because whatever else, because he's the guy who's been here the second longest, I guess. And that's all, I guess, somewhat conventional wisdom. I don't disagree with that conventional wisdom. I don't. Let's see what else. Are we going to go for now? Thank you. Hugh Nash says, we got to go. Then it takes 10 more laps around the comments section. Well, I said we got off at 11:15. It's 11:22. That's at least pretty close. So we'll come back, try to do some more comments tomorrow. Fun stuff. I like having the comments. Trust me. Whatever else I'd be doing if I wasn't doing this, this is preferable for me. So we'll always love doing it. Y'all check out the AJC online, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, AJC.com. So interesting stuff. Do y'all follow this? The Lamar Jackson stuff, where they franchise tagged him. Baltimore did. I believe they did what's called, and listen, what I know about the NFL can fit inside the palm of my hand here, but I believe that the official title for what the Baltimore Ravens did to Jackson is called the non-exclusive franchise tag, which I believe means that another franchise could match the offer to Jackson, relinquish 2 first-round picks to the Ravens as compensation, and Jackson could have moved on somewhere else. And none of the teams that were thought to potentially have interest in Jackson ended up having any interest, including the Atlanta Falcons, who seemingly like Desmond Ridder better than Jackson. This is controversial. There are some people who think that this kind of represents collusion in the aftermath of what Cleveland did last year with Deshaun Watson. In some cases, it makes Atlanta, in the eyes of some, look foolish because they could have had what they view as an exciting, thrilling, top-end quarterback, and instead going with the unproven Desmond Ridder. I don't believe I want to hitch my wagon to Lamar Jackson. I just don't. I think he'd be fun to watch, but he hasn't won squat in Baltimore. I'm assuming he won't win squat here. And as fun to watch as he is. Now, he has better wide receiver talent in Atlanta than he probably ever had in Baltimore. I'll certainly grant you that. But, I don't know that I view Lamar Jackson as a program change, franchise changing player. But it's certainly controversial because there's no doubt he would have sold tons of tickets here and made Atlanta far more fun to watch than it has been in a long time. But apparently Jackson's going to stay in Baltimore, and there'll be plenty of coverage of that, what Atlanta chose to do, online, ajc.com, about that. So read about the Lamar Jackson situation there. Also, it is official. Sports betting not going to be legal in Georgia. You can read about that there as well. And all kinds of other serious news, too. So all that online, ajc.com for that. Also, our friends at RS Andrews. You can find them online. Oh, and by the way, Jay Harwell mentioning, too. Falcons did re-sign Lorenzo Carter. Great to see a former Dog. Also, former Atlantan, went Norcross High School, kind of staying in the area here. You'd love to see that for Lorenzo. So that, I'm sure, is online, ajc.com as well. Thank you, Jay, for the reminder on that. Also, RS Andrews online. rsandrews.com for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. RS Andrews will show up. They'll do the work that's promised, the price is promised, including getting that air conditioning unit ready for the spring weather. It's warm right now. It's going to be even warmer later. That means it's time to get cool and comfortable by getting your AC unit tuned back up to factory fresh specs. You can find RS Andrews online at rsandrews.com for a lot more on that. We'll see you tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. We'll look forward to talking to you then.